Hayden, we are doing our last conversation for Lenten Learning 2021 and our engagement with this remarkable group of people. And as much as the remarkable group of people, the remarkable things that they've done with Tomas Halik's book. His book isn't bad, but where we have gone with this has been fantastic, I think.
I think that is very true, Peter. It's been so fun to not only have folks hang on and keep going, keep reading, stay engaged, but do so much more than that to bring Halik to our lives and to our world here at St. Paul, and to honestly wonder about that interaction and make some really beautiful things of it. So I am really excited to do that in something like a penultimate way as we get together here and with these groups, because it won't be the last time, I trust. We'll continue to catch people about this. It'll have a lasting impact in the best way.
I hope so. Certainly we've been dealing with ideas that don't just get solved and then we move on in life. Part of what's been so powerful about the things that Halik has pressed us to look at and invited us to look at is that they are more or less perennials. And year after year, season after season of life, we deal with these issues of how do we understand God? Where do we find God? What about the paradoxes of God's presence within our lives and yet God being creator of heaven and earth, and all those sorts of things that we've been dealing with. So, and in many ways, I think he really does a lovely job in these last 3 chapters of drawing together a lot of the threads that he has been playing with and teasing out and trying to analyze throughout the course of the book. So I really appreciated that. I found these 3 chapters in some ways among the easiest to read because he had laid so much foundation, but also because he's moving toward the end and not just analyzing anymore, but trying to draw things together. And as I've noted on the handout at the beginning of chapter 14 already, I think he just gets pretty lyrical by the last 10 pages or so.
Yes.
As we enter on chapter 12 with the question mark, and I think this is fascinating, the question mark, love the world. It strikes me that the questions that he's really asking of us are about ways in which, on the one hand, we don't love the world at all. And on the other hand, ways in which we love the world entirely too much. So the questions that I've suggested that we've come up with and my initial draft, our kind of discussion, the final reshaping of them. The questions that we've come up with at the end of chapter 12, these life questions are about the parts of the world that just drive us nuts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Where we either want to say, oh, just forget it and be done with that part of the world, or where we want to grab the world by the coattails and shake it and make it different. And what are those places in the world? Because those are the places where I think Halik's suggesting both of those responses don't love the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then his other one is, there are places where we just love the world too much, where we find that it suits us just fine, thank you very much, the way it is, and we're uncritical about whether this is the way God means for the world to be. Because If I actually were to answer that question, no, I might lose something in the process. And we've suggested, I don't know, oh, he does use the phrase idolizing there on, is it 146 maybe? About that this is a kind of idolatry, taking something in the world just for ourselves because it serves us well, and not asking the bigger question, how does God intend for this piece of the world to serve the whole creation, the whole in which God exists and cares, and the like?
Yeah, it strikes me that with that first question, Peter, about what it is that drives us nuts, there's a way in which we've been set up really well lately in the book to ponder that question, because we've had this theme of what it looks like to take reality as it is and not as we would like it to be.
Right.
And this sort of puts that to us in a different way, asking what are those parts of the world that we just really wish were different, and maybe even try to change, and how does that go for us, and what does it teach us?
Mm-hmm.
And then this second question, as you say, is kind of a new direction, and I really like the way you've put it here, Peter, because I think it is the case that sometimes we, as we are, encounter parts of our reality that, as you said, are just fine, thank you very much, because they're fine for us, and they sort of keep us comfortable where we are, with who we are, and with what we have. And we almost read that sometimes as divine blessing, even. I don't know that Halik goes there, but it seems to be part of his point that sometimes we even read that seeming consonance between our lives and the world and ourself and think, oh, yeah, this is great, without necessarily broadening to wonder, is it just great for us, or is it great for others and for the world that God intends in all its fullness?
Yeah.
And as we ask that broader question, we're brought back into that theme of embracing the whole of reality. So for those reasons, I like these questions, and I like this take on the Love the World chapter, because if the last three chapters were about facets of the world, this is about the whole thing in a way.
Indeed, indeed. When he comes near the end of the chapter to his distinction between two kinds of liberalism, the pluralist liberalism and then the universalist liberalism, it seems to me that those are the places where he's talking about the distinction between recognizing a world that is complicated and messy and doesn't fit anybody's human vision of utopia, right? One of our groups talked about this a little bit last week in terms of the various utopian schemes, the isms of the late 19th and early 20th century, each of which had its way of trying to create the perfect world, but usually it ended up happening by needing to just lop off a part of the world that doesn't fit. And here we come back to the quote that Halik has given us twice from Teilhard de Chardin, that love is the only power that can unify without destroying. And I think that really is central to his thinking about the God of love. So this pluralist liberalism doesn't have a clear program that has to be instituted in order for the world to be right, but rather it has a commitment to the diversity, to all the people who have a stake in the world, and to a process that is inclusive. The liberalism is the liberalism of spirit that is open to all of that diversity and all of its messiness and complexity, and doesn't try to shut it down either through this kind of secular humanism or through a fundamentalist religious vision.
Yeah, that's That seems right, Peter. And what comes to mind, if you'll indulge me for a second as you think about all those things, and if you all will indulge me too.
Please, we indulge away.
Yeah, is I was doing some reading recently on the biblical theme of empire and the way in which, in various ways, from Egypt to Assyria to Babylon, in the end, God sort of condemns empire in a way as a way to construct the world. And by the time we make our way through history, there's a way in which we have to then point the finger back at Christendom or Christian empire itself as somehow falling into this same trap of wanting everyone and everything to be the same, or to be according to one order, or to be unified programmatically. And I like setting that vision up next to this quote from Chardin about love unifying the world without destroying it, because it reveals that there actually is a way for God and God's love to unify the world that doesn't look like that. And it looks more like this pluralistic liberalism, or at least that's a piece of what's involved in God's vision and hope for the world, even to the end, as it were, or in eternity, as Halik might invite us to ponder in the coming chapters.
Yeah.
All of which is to say, I think there's plenty of room for us to consider, and Halik goes here, the ways in which too often Christian evangelism tends, as much as these extreme examples of these late 19th, early 20th century isms, to to morph the world into one sort of mold.
Yeah. I mean, I like my milk homogenized. I'm not sure that I want to have my world homogenized.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. And that's why he talks about that great hymn from Philippians 2 about Jesus Christ, though he was in the form of God, took on the form of a human being. He poured out his divinity, if you will, or pour out is typical translation of kenosis. But I think in some ways it's more like he poured his divinity into the messiness of the world, for the sake of the world. And that it's in doing that, as Halik has said, moving toward that which is problematic or even enemy, pouring ourselves into the world. And as he says, only God can really do that. And so the only way we can do that is in God. And now you come back to his whole idea about the God who is not only creator of heaven and earth, but the God who is in the very depth of ourselves. So if we're able to engage the world in God, then this question about love the world can address both the parts of it that drive us crazy and the parts of it that seduce us because they are so compatible with our desires, our needs, our comfort. And so in order, I think, to really use what Halik has given us in this chapter, I think it might be helpful for us to open up to one another some of those things that drive us nuts and some of those things that we just really love.
Yes, and what strikes me as you say that, Peter, is that there's a way in which those pair of questions, what drives us nuts and what is all too comfortable for us, lead us to that third question of, okay, so how do we take those things and love the world in a way?
Right.
But we have to do those questions first. So I think that'll be a great place to go with folks.
Great. So that'll deal with the questions that are raised by chapter 12, or at least some of them. I'm sure we'll hear other questions coming out of chapter 12. He has a remarkable capacity, I think, especially as he nears the end of the book, to talk in more of his erudite shorthand. Like, I'm glad you know all about Solzhenitsyn and these, laicite and all of that. Yeah, well, hopefully some of those notes are a little bit helpful in getting us just through the chapter. Well, and then we come to 13, Stronger Than Death. And there is in this chapter this very interesting effort to identify God's presence in those moments of deep loss and deep love. And I love the way that he points out that the phrase love is stronger than death isn't actually in the Bible. He talks about love is strong as death. And somehow that doesn't set them in opposition to each other, but rather it invites a sense of how can these moments of touching eternity, whether it's in the loss that death is, or whether it's in the depth of love that we feel in our closest relationships, hopefully in marriages, in deep friendships. He suggests quite explicitly that it's in the sexual union of human beings that this is felt. And how do we understand those to be God moments in some way, without being in any way blasphemous, right? And honestly, one of my questions as I read this chapter is, particularly with you in mind as a conversation partner, Hayden, I don't know when I was 28 that I would have had half the clue about what Halik's talking about that I have a little bit later in life. And that's not meant to shut you down on this chapter or not at all. I would have had plenty to say about it. I just don't know that I would have had much to understand about it yet. Anyway, you get my point.
Right.
I think there really is something about maturity and age and experience and just life that Halik is relying on as he works with this complex relationship of the eternal with these particularly deep moments of our human lives.
It reminds me, Peter, to just to your point, I feel like I can talk about this idea powerfully from scripture and from other places. I think of Paul's words in 2 Corinthians 4, talking about bearing in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus might also be revealed. And there's some kinship there between what Paul is getting at and what Halik is talking about. But as you say, regardless of age, though often age helps with this, you can talk about that, but to really understand it, to really approach its fullness, you kind of have to experience those moments in which you feel the death of Jesus, to use Paul's language, marking your own self, or to use more of Halik's language, to experience those moments of love and of grief that touch us on such a deep level, and trust. That some of it seems to be about trust, that those really are real and are not these sort of idolatrous loving of the world moments that Halik was talking about in chapter 12.
Yeah, and also coming from chapter 12, I think it has something to do with the way he talks about how we convey the faith among ourselves, that it's not by a reasoned argument or convincing somebody, but it's by living that faith in the presence and in the relationship with another person. And then they have that experience, and there is a question how they respond to that, but it's the God in the relationship who is asking the question and making the invitation and making possible the response, rather than somehow our calculation about how to convince somebody about what this experience means to me and should mean to them. And there I go again, the part of the world that I want to shake and change. So, yeah. Early in this chapter, he is back on his God is dead stuff, and that he says it's not God who died, but it is maybe God has died from our language. And I think he's spot on with that. The way in which God's name gets used in our language these days, either as a political slogan or as a curse word. And in public life, how much do we hear God spoken of other than that? And the idea that he really is committed to holding on to God in our language with one another communally, so that we understand that, as he says, God is not beyond the world stage, but in its forgotten depths. That's a great phrase. Some people know that when people ask me, how are you? My typical response is, thank God. And there's a whole reason for that. And actually, there was a Journey article that kind of explained that early on in my time at St. Paul. Happy to explain it to anybody. But it's amazing how unexpected that is for people to hear somebody say, thank God, in response to, how are you? And to bring God into that exchange. And I figure, in part, it's like, well, how are you is kind of a throwaway question. Most of the time, people don't really want to hear how I am. We don't have time for that, for one thing, and they're not necessarily in a position to respond to how I am at that point. I shouldn't burden them with it. So if I'm going to give a nothing response, why don't I at least give us a response that points to that which makes me capable of answering the question at all? And thank God.
Thank God. It reminds me of this question, Peter, that Halik talks about receiving from his colleague, I imagine, which, they say that, who knows, that we're maybe 20 or 30 years culturally behind Halik's world in this movement, but why do you go on talking about God? Why do you introduce that old, loaded, empty, confusing, equivocal word on 158 there? And I just think it's such a helpful moment, because for all of the ways that Halik has finessed and stretched and pushed back against all of our language about God with his negative theology and all of that, at the end, Halik does want to come back around and say, no, the word matters. We need that word. It will be startling, but we can startle folks in a loving way with that word. It doesn't have to, we don't have to beat people over the head with it or anything like that. And so I just find that kind of exciting, and think your example of thank God in response to how are you is a great example of different ways that could look.
And your reflection on that, and I just thank you for bringing that quote from Halik's colleague. I don't know whether Halik has it verbatim from the colleague or whether he dressed it up, but oh my gosh, what an eloquent statement of the perspective that Halik is trying to portray there from the secularized world. And I think part of what that does, as you've talked about it, wanting to bring God back into the language, wanting for there to be a place for God in the way that we engage with the world, it leads to this question for this chapter: how do we understand these losses or loves as God moments? And how do we think about any part of our lives, but especially, Halik would say, these moments of loss that focus us on God's ultimate holding everything together, and of love, which is the anticipation, the kind of foretaste, the little glimmer or just a taste of what that unity, that God holding it all together might actually be like. In those places especially, but then if we can talk about those places, maybe we can spread it a little bit and start to identify more easily, even for ourselves, where are our God moments? And I'm guessing some of them are in church, but if that's only an hour or 2 or 3, even if I'm a devoted choir member and learning participant and volunteer maybe 6 hours a week, if that's the only places where our God moments are, what does Paul say? We are of all people most to be pitied. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, Peter, that to take the even more extreme example of what you're talking about, what's fascinating about these examples of loss and love is if you think of 2 places where even people for whom church and faith are not habitual might show up at a church.
Yep.
Weddings and funerals are 2 of them. And there's this way in which church communities and pastors in particular, perhaps, but really whole faith communities, get to live into this challenge these days of making God's presence in those moments feel real and genuine and formative and not canned, because we're so used to hearing God invoked in those moments. And yet, and many of us, I think, do genuinely experience God in those moments. And yet somehow there's something about those moments that can fall flat or feel canned, to reuse that word. And so to think about that, and then, as you say, to broaden it, really does invite us into that challenge of when we're not at church, what do those God moments look like? And even when we are at church, how do those God moments remain real and connected with the rest of life? It reminds me, we have this Tuesday Coffee Conversations group. Some of you are familiar with it, I know, that hopefully will begin being on the North Lawn, though I look outside at the rain and wonder. And a couple weeks ago, we engaged this question of forgiveness and talking about, when do we actually use the words, I forgive you, in our lives? And you used those words with me just earlier today, Peter. I was a little late for an appointment with you, and you said, I forgive you. And it just, as we talked about that, and if you were to consider that in your own life, I imagine all of us would really start to wonder about how we use, or whether we use, those words. And I think it's this other example of what is inescapably God language in some way, this notion of I forgive you, but can feel uncomfortable to use and mean and live into. It's just another example.
It feels so pious. And
Yeah.
which of us wants to be, well, here again, it's the image that Halik's colleague projects, right? How can you be so naive? How can you be so simple? How can you be so, don't you know things are more complicated than that? For you to just stand there and say, besides, isn't that rather pompous of you to forgive me?
Exactly.
Well, although if you're a secular humanist, you got nobody else who's able to forgive you, so I better do it. But that's another argument. There I go. I'm starting to shake the secular humanist.
Starting to shake the world again, Peter.
But that does, I think, lead us directly into chapter 14, because what you're talking about is the way in which what Halik talks about as the tangible and the universal all interpenetrate one another. And that all of our religious and liturgical life, all of our spirituality in a Christian understanding is built on the incarnational moment. And again, we have this God pouring God's self into the human life, so that when we're dealing with the human, we're always dealing with the universal. And when we're dealing with the universal, we're always dealing with the human. And what he has identified, going back to the image from the first or second week of the ditches on the two sides of the farm road, are either falling into, oh, God is only about spiritual, eternal, ultimate, universal things, or there is no ultimate spiritual, universal anything. There's just humanity in all of its mess.
Right.
And here we are as Halik reaches the end of the book, and he's weaving these threads together so that he can identify the Christian life as this life of living in the world, but not of the world. Because to be of the world is to fall into that ditch. But if we fall into the other ditch, then we're not in the world. So to be both in it and not of it ends up being sort of the model for him of the Christian life.
It does. And it, for some reason, jogs in my head those words of the Nicene Creed, where we hear, and became truly human, which refer to Jesus as becoming truly human. And it just makes me think so much hangs on that truly part. It seems that's Halik's very vision that we might live into in God, for us too to be truly human as we navigate those ditches. That is something that we can be. It's reminiscent of late in the chapter, I think he raises this familiar phrase of, oh, we're only human, or it's just, we're human. What do you expect? We make this kind of mistake. To which Halik kind of responds, no, let's be truly human, as it were. That's not his words, but that's the phrase for me that connects up.
Yeah, indeed. And he contrasts that as the one place where he's acknowledged that he breaks with his mentor and muse, Friedrich Nietzsche, where Nietzsche had this book called Human, All Too Human. And that's actually a rather enigmatic, that in itself is almost a koan in Nietzsche studies, but it at least recognizes Nietzsche's focus on present existence. And he was, after all, the ancestor of existentialism, right? He's the great granddaddy of existentialist thought. But this idea that it is only human, or it's all too human. And what Halik wants to say is, no, it's not. Human is always wrapped up with the universal. But then that raises the question that we've honed for this chapter. Because to go back to Nietzsche, in that All Human, All Too Human book, he says there that he speaks about the chills and fears stemming from isolation. He's talking about his own life, partly living in his little hermitage in Sils Maria, where he spent a number of very, very productive summers, but almost as a hermit. That's what he called himself. So he's talking about the chills and fears stemming from isolation to which every person burdened with an unconditional difference of viewpoint is condemned. It just raises the question for us as Christians, I think, if we are in but not of the world, as Halik suggests. And of course, he's getting that from, long history within Christian theology. But if that's how we understand ourselves, isn't it the case that we are inevitably holding an unconditional difference of viewpoint from both the secular humanist and the dyed-in-the-wool fundamentalist religious person? And Halik says you can't give up on either of those. You can't fall into being either of those. This all has to be held together. But that very view that you can hold those together is in many ways unconditionally different as a viewpoint from certainly what they hold, and I think from what many of us hold in day-to-day life, where we have things about the world that drive us nuts, and we have things about the world that seduce us. It all wraps together. The guy's just lyrical at this point. But to get to the question, if we as Christians, in but not of, therefore have this difference of viewpoint from the world or from others, does that mean we kind of unavoidably are going to have at least some of these chills and fears and isolation that Nietzsche talks about?
It's a great, great question, because it really is, because to get at it from a different angle, Halik talks about God as being able to love the world because God is outside the world.
Right.
And that makes God sound so far away. And yet, as you keep reading and get to this point, maybe without even saying it, or maybe he does, and I'm forgetting, Halik is pointing to this reality that God's very otherness is part of what gets Christ treated the way that he is, and ultimately gets Christ crucified in a way, to take the extreme isolation, chills, and fears that Nietzsche is talking about.
Yeah.
When we think of God being outside the world, we think of it just as this far away God. But no, in Christ we see this in but not of the world, and the way it gets Jesus treated. So even as we think about that, we're inevitably invited to wonder for ourselves, do our lives include those very feelings of isolation, chills, and fear? And should they, if they don't?
Yeah.
I am really eager to hear what folks have to say about that.
This is going to be so good. And it's because I think in some ways at the end of this book, Halik has brought us to the beginning of a Lenten journey. And what we've been able to do as we've worked through this book is to explore and deepen and come to understand more fully that very question about our lives as Christians and what makes them Christian. And indeed, if part of what makes them Christian is that we join Jesus on that journey of inevitably, at some points at least, isolation, chills, and fears, then, oh my goodness, when we come to the cross on Good Friday, what a difference it makes in how we look at that cross and what we have to hope is on the other side of it. Wow.
To that point, Peter, I am sure glad Easter is coming soon, because if Halik has only brought us to the beginning of our Lenten journey, I'm not sure I'm up for that journey just yet, Peter. That's all I have to say about that.
And what God would say about that, Hayden, is, I forgive you.
Oh, gosh.
Which is also what this whole Lenten journey is about. But how can we really hear and understand forgiveness if we don't really hear and feel and understand the ways in which we need that forgiveness?
Yes. Amen.
Anyway, it's been quite a journey.
It has.
We come to the last of our conversations here and look forward to the last of our formally scheduled discussions with the groups that have been reading Halik and on this journey with us and helping to shape and guide it, which has been great. Certainly if there are other questions or concerns that have been raised by our conversations here, maybe even by people who have been catching the video but haven't been able to be in the discussion. Here are our email addresses at the church. So if people want to continue some of the conversation, they can contact us to ask about that. And those can even be in person. It doesn't have to be just by email, but that's the best way to contact us. And I know that with those who've been in these conversations already, as we said at the beginning, that some of this conversation will certainly continue.
Absolutely. To borrow Halik's phrase, the whole thing has been a first word in a sense. And yet, in that same vein, I'm very curious what folks will say to this very last question, Peter. What one thought might you offer someone who asks, what did you get from Halik's book in your discussion?
Yeah.
That's quite the assignment, really. And yet maybe it's made a little easier if it's just the first word of that conversation that the person's inviting us into.
Brilliantly put, Hayden. Thank you so much for the partnership that you've offered and all that you've brought to this conversation and to our discussions, for your leadership in our sessions, and to all of you who have been a part of this in our discussions. Thank you for hanging in there with this book and for finding in it places where you can bring yourselves into a Lenten journey and a set of relationships that we pray have been meaningful, upbuilding, spiritually enriching for each and every one of you.